All right, welcome to another edition of the CLE Sports PT and Performance webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about acceleration and deceleration and why it's important in sports. Just to show you all what's coming up on alternate. So next Tuesday we have a presentation on agility training. These are all going to be 15 minutes coming up, or even shorter, just because we've gotten good feedback so far about the shorter sessions, the shorter webinars. We're going to try to keep it like that. And then every other Thursday, normally we'd be doing the sports and sports performance coaches. There's going to be a little bit of a change due to a conflict I have the week after that would have been the normal week for that webinar. Instead on the 12th, so next Thursday. So we'll have a webinar on Tuesday and on Thursday. Thursday is going to be on polarized versus periodized training, more for endurance athletes. And well, really endurance athletes. And then, as I mentioned, Tuesday, we're talking about agility training. So you can stay up to date on my social media to figure out what's coming next. All right, so acceleration. What is acceleration? I think we all kind of know what it is, but from a physics perspective, we're just understanding that it's how quickly we're changing speed. So how quickly we are increasing our speed, increasing our velocity, and trying to get towards maximum speed. So, and this is really, it's not just, we think about it a lot when we're thinking about like running a 100-yard dash, when we're coming out of the blocks and exploding out of the blocks and trying to hit our max speed. But it's in any sport that the body has to start, speed up, change direction when we're talking about cutting sports. There's two phases, and it depends on how much distance the athlete has to accelerate, what speed they're going to hit, and how much acceleration they're going to have. So the initial phase is where you're going from 0 to, trying to get from 0 to 100. In track sprinting, this is called the drive phase. This is where they literally start from nothing and come out of the blocks. And the force that the athlete is putting through the ground in this time, or it could be if you're standing around in the field, under a soccer field or a lacrosse field or a basketball court, and understand that you have to switch, like change directions and get, to a spot or a player very quickly. Your first few steps are going to be horizontal. So if you're not, in a sense, or you're driving the force through the ground kind of horizontally. I should say it that way. You're not stepping horizontally, but the force is directed that way because you're kind of pushing off the ground. Think about that track sprinter coming out of the blocks. They're pushing behind them to kind of dig into the ground and propel themselves forward as fast as they can. From that point, as the distance increases that somebody's accelerating, their force through the ground starts to be more vertical. So and that's a typo there, where it transitions to a vertically applied ground reaction force. I apologize for that. That's where they're starting to get close to max speed, and to sustain max speed, they need to be kind of driving into the ground as they're going. Again, this is as the distance increases, you're hitting this transition phase. Sometimes, depending on, if it's a short sprint where you have to get to a spot that's just, 5 yards away, you may not have time to hit that vertical phase. It's your steps are going to be, your force is going to be directed horizontally. Oppositely, the physics of deceleration is where we have to come to a stop. We have to hit the brakes very fast. This is critical to most sports. So you have to get to a spot very quickly, but once you get to that spot, you have to stop. So whatever speed you're generating, you need to be able to slow it down very quickly. Any kind of force or stop. So this is, when we think about cutting sports, we've talked about the track example, running a 100-meter dash. That's pretty easy to visualize, where you're, linearly going. When you have to play a cutting sport where you're trying to change directions to any degree, sideways, backwards, backpedaling, diagonal, whatever it is, that is going to put different deceleration forces on the body. The biggest thing to take out of today's talk is just that accelerating and decelerating are very, very metabolically taxing. It puts a lot of toll on the body to, one, generate speed, generate force to accelerate, and also to brake. Braking forces are even more. When you think about a car and having, braking 100 miles an hour versus braking at 20 miles an hour is very different. So if we have a very explosive, very powerful athlete that can accelerate very well, then we have to teach them how to apply the brakes. That's another force, and that's another thing that can put a lot of stress on the body. And if you play a sport where this can be, we're going to talk about this in soccer in a second, when you play a sport where you have to do this repeatedly, game after game after game, that takes a lot out of the body. It may be something worth monitoring in the future. A lot of pro and kind of elite athletes that play team sports do monitor this via GPS, but it's something just to take note if you're an athlete that doesn't have access to that technology, just understanding that it still matters for you too. With deceleration, as I just kind of mentioned, you have this exceptionally large force. You're at speed, and then exceptionally large force to stop, and in a very short time. So being able to stop on a dime is a very a split second that you're having to put the braking force on. When you're running a suicide drill and you have to get to the line as quickly as possible. When you have to get to another player, you have to get to the ball. All of these things, you have to get to that spot very quickly and stop very quickly, right where you need to be on the field or the court, because your success in the play depends on that. The primary muscles used, so you're using your quad and you're using your calf, otherwise known as the gastroc. So for both acceleration and deceleration, you're using those primarily. You're using other muscles too, but those are kind of the big prime movers. The difference is when you're accelerating, it's a powerful, what we call concentric contraction, meaning that muscle has to squeeze very powerfully, just like you think a muscle would squeeze to propel the body forward. Deceleration, those muscles are still working, but they're working in what we call an eccentric fashion. This is kind of a weird concept, but I always think of it as like the term eccentric, like just a little different. That eccentric person, eccentric friend of yours, this contraction is a little bit different. That muscle, instead of squeezing, it's a lengthening contraction. So as they're getting and stopping, you're still using your quadriceps, but it's actually lengthening out as it's working. It's an odd concept, but if you think about how your muscles feel, if you're ever on on a day that you're really sore and your legs are really sore, try to walk down the stairs. Your quads are working as you're walking down the stairs in an eccentric way. And you can feel how that, if your muscles are sore, they'll be a lot more noticeable, and you can understand how that motion feels, just knowing that they're still working, but they're working in a different way. They're working to make sure that you don't fall all the way down the steps, or working against gravity to kind of help you lower slowly down that step. So I just want to use an example of soccer, just because I have experience with soccer and I have access to a couple papers here that I wanted to share. This really can be applied to, this concept can be applied to other field sports. So lacrosse, field hockey, court basketball, handball. The game demands are likely increasing. In soccer, we know it's documented here, but athletes are getting bigger, faster, stronger. So I anecdotally would be able to say that that's happening in other sports too. So by 2030, soccer is predicted to, the speed of the game is going to improve. We've looked at data in the English Premier League from 2006 and 2007 and compared that to 2012, 2013 seasons. There was a 20% increase in the distance covered in what they call high intensity running. So that's sprinting. That's things where you would have to accelerate for. So there's 3% increase a year in the amount of ground that players are able to get to fast. There's a 50% increase. That's a huge increase in the number of high intensity actions. So these are these accelerations, decelerations, quick bursts of speed, getting to the ball fast. And the prediction is that there's going to be another 40% increase by 2030. That's not that long. That's not that far away. The game demands, as I mentioned, are increasing. So in soccer, you can see it if you ever watch Liverpool or Manchester City play. There's a very high pressing, high pressure form or method that they play with. I know Jurgen Klopp calls it heavy metal soccer, where they're going all out, all at their opponents all the time. They're counterattacking. So as soon as you win a ball, they're going to kind of come right at you. That requires a lot of sprinting. So the science behind that is there's a lot of fitness and there's a lot of acceleration and deceleration that has to take place just to do that for 90 minutes of the match. Players in positions that did not have to run a whole lot previously, central defenders, goalkeepers, are now expected to contribute a lot more. The goalkeepers have to do a decent amount of running because they will start the attack on the field. Again, as I mentioned, players are just expected to cover more distance at high speeds, and we're seeing the data reflect that. Now, that does two things. I mentioned that all those accelerations and decelerations are very metabolically taxing. So they're very physically taxing, but they're also mentally fatiguing as well, because you're having to make split-second decisions and make sure that you get to a ball very fast. So there is data showing that there is a lot in terms of that is a load on players. I've given a different talk on it's on the YouTube channel as well on what data can do when you track data. And I've talked about load in that. So if you're wondering what that is, just go back to that video on there and just understand that both of those things tie into player load and a very high player load at that point, because as I mentioned, like having to sprint and explode to get to a ball and stop very quickly is going to put a lot more on the body than going for a long, slow, leisurely jaunt around the field. There's also an increase of risk of muscle injuries with this too, because of the load it takes on the body. So the game demands are increasing in sports. We have to better prepare for them with our athletes too, just to make sure that they don't break down and they can handle these high demands. And I'm giving stats from English Premier League soccer, but there's a trickle down effect too. If the highest levels are getting better, the lower levels below it, because these are the people trying to get to the higher levels, they're also going to be getting better. So really, as I just mentioned, the issue is trying to prepare the players for what the game is of the future, whatever the sport is. And if it's a sport that requires a lot of high intensity kind of sprinting, stopping, starting, making sure that you're training them to do it. But training them, I would recommend at the right time. So again, these are intense. These take a lot out of the body. You want to time this training properly. So if they have a game coming up, you don't want to be doing this right before a game so that they have time to recover. These are things that you should probably be starting in preseason, working with them. And then, again, on stretches of time where you have some recovery, where you have a couple of days before you're doing a big match, because it will take a toll on the body and then we're counterproductive here. But what you want to do is emphasize the number and the density of the sprint. So like, how many of these sprints are you going to do within 1 to 2 minutes? Like what is your sport? And how many of these sprints are required during it? We have data on that in a lot of sports too. Like I know in soccer, in a 90-minute match, they need to perform a certain amount of high intensity actions, and we need to be kind of working towards that. That being said, certain players can do better or worse with some of those. So understanding that you may need to individualize that training program. If that person's coming off an injury, if that person just can't take as much load as the next person, maybe some people need to be pushed and they need more load, whatever it is. As much as you can individualize your plans to players, the better off you're going to be. And that's where data comes into effect. So again, I mentioned that's been topics of previous weeks. That'll be topics for future week discussions. But for now, there's a few videos up on the YouTube channel that will address that. So feel free to check those out. Very briefly, as I mentioned, there's more detail on the YouTube channel, but just data can give objective numbers on the ability, and they can track changes and look at fatigue, and the data can tell us how many of those sprints is a person doing, how many of those sprints does a person need to do. And just so we're not, accidentally going from 30 to 90 in a session, because that can very much increase your risk for injury. There's different technology out here. This is an example. I am not an affiliate by PlayerMaker. Full disclosure, I tried to be an affiliate. I got denied. So I'm still showing their picture on here because I think they have a good system. But it's a GPS system that you can wear on your shoe that will show kind of the distance covered, the sprint distance, and that kind of thing. There are other Catapult, Stat Sports, or other things out on the market that are being used in different sports. These are, again, an example of soccer, but this is being used in basketball. This is being used in football. This is commonplace among elite athletes and so high level, college and pro. With something like a PlayerMaker, that's something you can actually buy and put on your shoe. We do have some athletes that I work with that do have it, because it's not super expensive of the system, and they can get stats, which are very helpful for me. I can see how much distance they covered in a training session, and can scale up or down performance training accordingly, just because based on what they did, the day before. All right, I think we're at my time limit for today, and I appreciate you tuning in. I'll stay on for any questions, but otherwise, thanks for joining today, and I'll see you all next Tuesday.